Welcome participants to this MOOC course on disaster management. The content of this course is not only relevant for the different syllabuses on disaster management, but also for general understanding of the growing incidents of destruction, losses of life and property, etc. This MOOC course is of great relevance in contemporary world. I am Shahab Fazal, faculty in the Department of Geography at Aligarh Muslim University. A disaster is an event or a situation that causes significant crisis situation, destruction or disruption, leading to the loss of life, property and livelihoods. Disasters can be any natural such as earthquake, floods, or man-made like industrial accidents, wars, etc., etc. These events can devastate communities and also systems, the life systems of mankind, and they require urgent responses to manage the aftermath of the incident and to rebuild, to recover from this situation, this adverse situation. And in modern world, disasters are more common, more frequent, more widespread and unpredictable. And to some extent, I would say that they are inevitable. So how we need to respond to these unwanted events, situations? The remedy lies with human efforts to reduce the impacts of these events through preparedness, planning, and effective response strategies. So can we consider disaster management as a developmental approach, developmental policy or strategy? Think about it. For this, we need to understand the phenomena of disaster and its management. If you consider the three definitions which are being displayed now, they have been given by United Nations. They gives us a perspective on the human-centric losses. Here, the UN defines a disaster as detrimental impacts from hazards in places where people live in and exposed or vulnerable conditions which may be due to the poor planning or development or even due to lack of preparation. Another definition by United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, it defines disaster in a more qualitative framework. Like many other definitions, this looks beyond the social aspects of the disaster and its impacts. It also focuses on losses. This raises the need for emergency response as an aspect of disaster. It does not set out quantitatively threshold or scales for damage, death or injury. The third definition by United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, commonly known as UNISDR, it highlights the catastrophic situation in which the normal patterns of life have been disrupted and extraordinary emergency interventions are required to save and preserve human lives and the environment. As per the Indian Disaster Management Act 2005, a disaster is defined in a very elaborative form as a catastrophe, mishap, calamity, or grave occurrence in any area arising from natural or man-made causes, or by accident, or even by negligence, which results into losses, substantial losses of life or human suffering or damage or destruction of property, or even damage or destruction to environment. Such a nature or magnitude which is beyond the coping capacity of the community of the affected area. So here the interesting addition to the definition is that these events, these disastrous events, these detrimental events, the losses are so enormous that we cannot cope with our own resources. And that is why the Indian Disaster Management Act highlights in its definition, in its elaboration of the term disaster, as that the magnitude is so massive that it is beyond the coping capacity of the community of that particular area. So here disasters are considered to produce a range of impacts. These includes direct, the impacts may be secondary or indirect effects also. Direct effects include deaths, injuries, or physical damages, etc. However, secondary disaster impacts such as releasing of some gases, fire incident due to the event, disastrous event, or hazardous material that is triggered by disaster. So finally, impact includes the ripple effect resulting from the flow of goods, services, or even impacting the livelihood of the population, say unemployment, etc. So a disaster is an event or series of events which gives rise to casualties and damage or losses of property, infrastructure, environment, essential services, or means of livelihood. And that too on such a scale which is beyond the normal capacity of the affected community to cope with their own resources. So, disaster is an event which is harmful, detrimental, which refers to losses to the entire life systems. The characteristic feature of the term disaster is that it is sudden in nature. It happens abruptly. So, sudden event means that in some way the people, the population, the community, the society, they remain unprepared or less prepared to this adverse situation which is evolved by the event. So, this results into more losses since the people, the society, they are unprepared to that event, and the magnitude of the event is large. And in that context, we call it as that the disasters are sudden in nature. Another characteristic is a crisis situation. Crisis situation means the magnitude of crisis is greater. Since the event is so massive that the result of it creates crisis situation. And as I am saying that the feature of disaster is that it is massive in nature. Now massive in terms of space, the spatial extent that can be widespread or large geographic space where some colossal losses have incurred. Then another characteristic, if you look into these definitions of disaster, they may cause substantial losses. You see, the magnitude of losses would also be very important to consider any event as disaster. Now, substantial refers here to enormity of event and losses, which cannot be overcome, cope with by own resources, the internal resources. This refers to the exceeding their ability and or capacity, meaning to cope with the situation, we require the society, the community, or even the nation. They require external help and support to overcome this disastrous event. So just to summarize that these definitions, they point out some important characteristic of disasters. And if I can repeat them again, I would say that these disasters will be always detrimental to the community. There would be losses. These events would be harmful, more specifically to the life system of the human being. In some way, they would be sudden in the way that we will not be able to prepare to the losses which are incurred by the event. These events result into crisis situation. It will be massive in nature and also substantial, which we would be unable to cope with our own resources. So if I can explain these definitions, I would say that you will have a fair idea about the various characteristic features of the disaster. So for a layman, any event that causes certain disruption in life can well be considered as a disaster. But in disaster studies literature, different terms are used, mostly interchangeably, to describe various kinds of untoward, unwanted events in life of a people. For instance, in popular discourse, apart from disaster, terms such as crisis, emergency, catastrophe are consciously used to describe a particular incident. Such usage of apparently interchangeable terms is conditioned by the context in which the event is described or studied. The occurrence of disaster is influenced by both endogenous, inherent, and exogenous, external factors. So, understanding disasters involve analyzing their causes, impacts, and the measures needed to mitigate them. For that, we need to understand the different types of disaster. If a very general classification would be that it can be natural or man-made disaster. We all know that natural disasters are caused by natural factors on which humans do not have any control. Like all the geological movements, the most common example is earthquake, climatic changes like storms, droughts, cyclones, etc. Or more commonly, the biological phenomena, the pandemics like coronavirus disaster. Another kind of disasters are human-made disaster, man-induced disaster, which are results of human actions. More commonly, if I can give example of say pollution, nuclear accidents, or wars over the earth's surface, the conflicts at local level or at regional level. Then in the context of disaster and its management, their impacts, they are also very important to understand. Their impacts can be social, like loss of lives, displacement, which result into migration, the emotional trauma, or the economic implications, like leading to damage of infrastructure, loss of livelihoods, cost of recovery, or environmental, which includes destruction of ecosystems, pollution, a much talked about climate change, global warming, the long-term climatic effects. These are all impacts of disasters. Now, another dimension of disaster study is its mitigation and preparedness, which focuses on identifying the probability of destruction for any event, that is risk assessment, and preparing for early warning systems. Strengthening resilience with community awareness and education in order to minimize the losses and adverse impact. We may go for building resilient infrastructure. Furthermore, from management or administrative point of view, different terms are used in different countries to denote the machinery for the management of discourse. Disasters is incidents, for instance, in USA, the machinery for disaster management is officially called as emergency management, whereas in India, the same machinery is used to be known as crisis management or disaster management. Nonetheless, in contemporary times, disaster per se has come to be recognized as specialized concept with certain specific attributes. Though various scholars have tried to define the term disaster in different way, where the inherent attributes of disasters, they have been highlighted. So for understanding disaster, I would say as disruptive elements, disasters have been part and parcel of human life. Since time memorial, at no point of time probably a person can claim immunity or be safe from any kind of untoward happening in our life. They are undesirable, if not catastrophic impact on routine pattern of life. These incidents, they are imminent. They may happen. Despite of all our resilience, despite of all our preparation. And that is why they are called as disaster. Because these unwanted events, they do happen over the earth's surface, impacting the human life and property. The range of such occurrences are very wide. On one side, they may arise out of unintended human or mechanical failures leading to fire, industrial accidents, air crashes, road accidents, etc. On the other hand, these incidents may be caused by natural processes, resulting into earthquake, cyclone, flood, drought, etc., etc. In between these two, there may be many certain conscious attempts at causing harm to life and assets, such as, say, terrorist attack, suicide bombing, or wars among nations, or at local level there may be friction or violence. Notwithstanding their commonality in causing disruptions to the normal course of life, these incidents vary to a large extent on many accounts. For instance, they differ in terms of their causal factors, intended damages, intensity and breadth of impact, and coping capacity of a community to overcome setbacks to life. Now, the pertinent question is, could all these disruptive incidences be called as disasters? Or attempt at finding an appropriate answer to question lead us to venture into complex world of understanding the meaning of disaster and conceptualizing it as a social phenomena. So, in this initial part of our discussion on disaster management, I wanted to highlight the term disaster and why they are called as disaster. If I can say that the term disaster owes its origin to the French word désastre, which is the combination of two words, des meaning bad and another ester. It refers to a star, and in early days, a disaster was considered to be due to some unfavorable star, or more commonly I would say, it was supposed to be a god's curse on the humanity. Nowadays, the term disaster is commonly used to denote any odd event, be it natural or man-made, which brings misery to a region, so much so that it becomes difficult to cope with the situation through local resources. So, disasters are serious disruption of the functioning of society, causing widespread human, material, environmental losses, which exceed the ability of the affected people to cope with the situation with their own resources. There can be impacts of disaster, like falling apart of normal pattern of life, falling apart the normal system of life, normal pattern, normal system of life, loss of life, property, adverse impact on economic and social structure, disruption in communities, basic need of shelter, food, clothing, and even medical necessities, onset of psychological trauma, the loss of livelihood, disruption of communication, transportation, and losses of infrastructural facilities. It may lead to law and order problems also. There are epidemiological threats also. And all of this, they may also lead to displacement of population and animals also, which I will call it as migration. And this migration can be short-term as well as long-term. However, the above impacts not only negative, since the negatives could open up positive avenues of development and growth also. In modern day, we call it as opportunities in disaster, आपदा में संभावना, or to respond appropriately, effectively to the situation, like managing the resources. If I can give the example of managing of water resources in reservoir, which ultimately leads to control of flood. Conceptually, disaster is a product of interrelated processes consisting of people's interactions with their surroundings. In other words, conduct of the life of human being is surrounded by a combination of natural and man-made hazards. There are natural situations and there is human response to it, and they all are hazardous in many cases. At the same time, people are also subject to a number of vulnerabilities that place them at the risk of encountering any untoward happenings. And when the vulnerability of human beings come across the hazards of life, risks get real and disaster take place by inflicting losses. Thus, hazards, vulnerabilities and risks are critical factor in causation of a disaster. These terms would be elaborated in subsequent discussions, but here I am only using these terms, and their meaning and their elaboration would take place a little later in other lectures. But here it is very important to understand that the relative value of these factors, the hazard, vulnerability and risk, is very important in defining the concept of disaster. As an area of study, disaster needs to be understood from different disciplinary perspectives, such as earth sciences, engineering, sociology, geography, social psychology, public administration. You can name many other disciplines also. So, in defining the concept of disaster, disciplinary orientation is critical, but each one of them, they are relevant in the context of disaster studies. Nevertheless, despite these complexities, there seems to be unanimity that the disaster is a product of an intricate processes whose concrete reflection is seen in the form of an event or incident. The process invariably involves the central element of hazard, vulnerability and risk, whose clear understanding appears mandatory for grasping the understanding for disaster. So, the concept of disasters are as disturbances in societal or environmental equilibrium, which can be mitigated through proactive policies. It critiques the traditional view of disasters as purely natural events and advocates for a systems perspective. This approach considers both ecological and social dimensions, viewing disasters as totaling events that arises from the interaction of societal structures and environmental factors. Hazards act as catalysts, revealing existing systemic pressures and vulnerabilities. A systemic understanding emphasizes the role of human actions, values, and incomplete knowledge, such as development and planning processes over time, in turning underlying hazards into disasters. This perspective highlights the need for integrated, proactive approaches to disaster management. So, with this understanding, disaster study is an attempt to inquire into the process of a hazard turning to disaster, to identify the causes and rectify the same through public policy. Administrative factors such as poor building in an earthquake-prone zone, poor land use planning in flood-prone areas, which may lead to housing critical facilities in any risk zone, allowing habitation in such zones, poor laws that fail to regulate facilities leading to disasters, such as the Bhopal gas leak, the general low-risk perception among people, more significantly policy makers, that hinders the interest articulation for preventive policy for disaster management, create conditions that lead to low-lying inherent hazard turning into disaster. So here, to end this session, I pose a question with regard to understanding of the phenomena. What is your opinion? Can disaster occur in an uninhabited area or where the people are not involved? Would there be any disaster? That means any event, if they do not adversely impact the people, could it be a disaster? The issue is that in our understanding of disaster, that the focus all the time in disaster study is on human being. Human beings are at the center, core of disaster study. So whenever we call disaster any event, that means it is inflicting losses. To whom? To people, their life system. So the focus is on to people, or the source, the cause of the disastrous event. That is also very important for disaster study. You think about it, explore about it. So now I wind up this session. Happy learning.